In the grand halls of Valdoria Palace, where portraits of ancient kings watch from gilded frames, and every whispered conversation echoes through marble corridors, some secrets are buried so deep they threaten to shake the very foundations of a thousand-year monarchy. What happens when a king discovers that the woman he trusted most, the one who stands beside him at state dinners and royal ceremonies, has been hiding a truth so devastating it could destroy not just their marriage, but the entire royal lineage? In a world where every move is scrutinized by millions and where duty comes before personal happiness, King Alexander VII of Valdoria is about to learn that sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom come not from outside enemies, but from the shadows within the palace walls themselves. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ornate Persian rugs of the Valdoria Palace Library as King Alexander VII sat hunched over a leather-bound ledger, his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose. At 58, the king maintained the dignified bearing that had served him well through 23 years of rule, though the silver threading through his dark hair spoke of the weight of the crown he had worn since his father's unexpected death. The library had always been Alexander's sanctuary, a place where he could escape the endless parade of ministers, diplomats, and courtiers who filled his days with matters of state. Here, among the thousands of volumes collected by generations of Valdorian monarchs, he found the peace that eluded him in the throne room or the council chambers. This particular morning, however, peace was the furthest thing from his mind. 3 days earlier, his personal secretary, James Morrison, had approached him with an unusual request. A historian from the University of Valdoria, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, had been researching the royal archives for a book about the kingdom's involvement in various international relief efforts over the past 3 decades. She had specifically requested access to certain financial records from the Royal Charitable Foundation, the organization that Queen Consort Isabella had founded and personally managed for the past 15 years. Alexander had initially seen no reason to deny the request. The foundation's work was exemplary, funding everything from disaster relief efforts in developing nations to educational programs for underprivileged children within Valdoria itself. Isabella had transformed what was once a ceremonial organization into a genuinely impactful force for good, and Alexander was immensely proud of her accomplishments. If anything, he welcomed the opportunity for the foundation's work to receive additional academic attention. But Dr. Thornfield's preliminary findings, delivered in a confidential report that now lay open before him, painted a picture that made his blood run cold. The irregularities had started small, according to the historian's meticulous documentation. In 2018, several large donations to the foundation had been processed through what appeared to be shell companies registered in offshore tax havens. The amounts were significant, but not enormous by royal standards, roughly £2 million spread across 6 months. What made them suspicious was the complex routing through multiple accounts before the money eventually reached its stated charitable destinations. Alexander removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, trying to process what he was reading. Isabella had always handled the foundation's operations with what seemed like admirable independence. She regularly briefed him on major initiatives and always provided annual summaries of their activities, but the day-to-day financial management had been entirely her domain. He had trusted her completely, never imagining there might be reason for suspicion. The report grew more troubling as it progressed. Dr. Thornfield had identified a pattern of donations that coincided with several key political moments in Valdoria's recent history. Large sums had flowed into the foundation just weeks before Alexander had made controversial decisions about trade agreements, military deployments, and diplomatic recognitions. The timing could have been coincidental, but the historian had noted similar patterns in other European monarchies that had later been embroiled in influence peddling scandals. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a series of meetings that Isabella had held with representatives from Meridian Industries, a multinational corporation with significant interests in Valdoria's emerging renewable energy sector. These meetings, which had taken place at various private locations rather than at the palace, had never appeared on Isabella's official calendar. Yet financial records showed that companies connected to Meridian had made substantial donations to the foundation during the same period that Alexander was considering legislation that would greatly benefit their business interests. Alexander stood and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, where Isabella could often be found in the early mornings tending to her prized rose collection. She had brought those roses with her when they married 16 years ago, cuttings from the garden of her family's estate, in neighboring Astoria. The garden had become her retreat, just as the library was his, a place where she claimed she could think clearly away from the pressures of royal duty. Their marriage had not been a love match, at least not initially. It had been arranged by their respective families as part of a broader diplomatic initiative to strengthen ties between Valdoria and Astoria following years of economic tension. But, over time, what had begun as mutual respect and affection had deepened into something that Alexander genuinely believed was love. Isabella was intelligent, compassionate, and shared his commitment to using their position to benefit others. She had brought warmth and purpose to his often solitary existence as a monarch. The thought that she might have been deceiving him, that her charitable work might be a front for something more sinister, felt like a physical blow. Alexander had already lost so much to the demands of kingship. His first marriage had crumbled under the pressure of constant public scrutiny. His relationship with his 2 children from that marriage remained strained despite years of effort. Isabella had been the one bright spot in a life defined by duty and sacrifice. A soft knock at the library door interrupted his brooding. Isabella herself entered, carrying a silver tray with tea and the morning newspapers. She was dressed in a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she wore pulled back in the elegant chignon she favored for morning activities. At 45, she retained the poise and beauty that had first impressed the diplomatic corps when she arrived in Valdoria as a young woman. "I thought you might like some Earl Grey," she said, setting the tray down on a small table near his reading chair. "You've been in here since dawn, and I know you missed breakfast again." Alexander forced a smile, though he could feel the tension in his face. "Thank you, my dear. I've been reviewing some historical materials." Isabella's eyes fell on the open report, and, for just a moment, Alexander thought he detected a flicker of something in her expression. Concern? Fear? But it passed so quickly that he wondered if he had imagined it. "Anything interesting?" she asked, her tone light and conversational. "Research about charitable organizations and their impact on international relations," Alexander replied carefully. "Rather dry stuff, really." Isabella nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "Alexander, you know you can talk to me about anything that's troubling you, don't you? I sometimes worry that you carry too much alone." The irony of her words struck him like a slap. Here she was, offering comfort and support, while he sat surrounded by evidence that she might be the source of his greatest worry. "Of course," he managed. "I'll keep that in mind." After she left, Alexander returned to Dr. Thornfield's report with renewed focus. The historian had been thorough in her research, cross-referencing financial records with Isabella's travel schedules, official events, and even social media posts. A disturbing picture emerged of a woman who had carefully constructed a dual existence, maintaining her public role as a devoted queen consort while engaging in activities that could only be described as suspicious. The evidence was largely circumstantial, Alexander had to admit. Unusual financial patterns, questionable meetings, and convenient timing did not necessarily constitute proof of wrongdoing. But, taken together, they suggested something that made his stomach churn with anxiety. If Isabella was involved in some form of corruption or influence peddling, the scandal would not only destroy their marriage, but potentially bring down the monarchy itself. Valdoria's constitution was clear on such matters. The royal family was expected to maintain absolute integrity in all financial dealings. Even the appearance of impropriety could trigger a constitutional crisis that might result in the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. Such transformations had swept across Europe in recent decades, and Alexander was acutely aware that his own kingdom's survival depended on maintaining public trust. He needed more information before confronting Isabella directly. The accusations were too serious and the potential consequences too grave to proceed based on speculation alone. But he also couldn't simply ignore what he had learned. Too much was at stake. Alexander picked up his secure telephone and dialed a number he rarely used. Sir Geoffrey Walsh, the director of the Royal Protection Service, answered immediately. "Your Majesty, how may I assist you?" "Geoffrey, I need to speak with you privately. Can you come to the library immediately?" "Of course, sir. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Sir Geoffrey had served the royal family for over 30 years, first as a detective with the Metropolitan Police and later as head of palace security. He was one of the few people Alexander trusted completely, a man whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. If anyone could help him navigate this crisis, it would be Geoffrey. True to his word, Sir Geoffrey knocked on the library door exactly 5 minutes later. He was a tall, lean man in his early 60s, with steel-gray hair and the alert bearing of someone accustomed to anticipating threats. His expression grew serious as soon as he saw Alexander's face. "What's happened, sir?" Alexander handed him Dr. Thornfield's report without preamble. "Read this. All of it. Then, tell me what you think we should do." Sir Geoffrey settled into a chair and began reading, his expression growing increasingly grim as he progressed through the document. Alexander watched him carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened and his grip on the papers intensified. When he finally finished, Sir Geoffrey set the report down and looked directly at the king. "This is very serious, Your Majesty. If even half of these implications are accurate, we're looking at a potential scandal that could threaten the monarchy." "That's what I was afraid you'd say," Alexander replied. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Sir Geoffrey was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "We need to investigate this thoroughly before taking any action. The evidence here is suggestive, but not conclusive. However, given the potential consequences, we can't afford to ignore it." "What kind of investigation are you proposing?" "I recommend we engage a private security firm with experience in financial crimes. Someone outside the normal palace structure who can conduct a discreet but thorough examination of the Foundation's records and the Queen Consort's activities. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we can decide how to proceed." Alexander nodded slowly. It was a sensible approach, though the thought of investigating his own wife felt like a betrayal of everything their marriage represented. How long would such an investigation take? Probably several weeks, possibly longer depending on what they find. In the meantime, we'll need to be extremely careful about maintaining normal appearances. If there is wrongdoing involved, we can't risk alerting anyone that we're aware of it. The idea of pretending everything was normal while suspecting Isabella of serious crimes seemed almost impossible. How could he sit across from her at state dinners, attend public events at her side, and maintain the facade of a loving marriage while wondering if she was betraying everything he stood for? "There's something else we need to consider," Sir Geoffrey continued. "If the Queen Consort is involved in illegal activities, she may not be acting alone. We need to identify all possible co-conspirators and understand the full scope of any conspiracy." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The thought that Isabella might be part of a larger network of corruption was even more terrifying than the possibility that she had acted alone. Who else might be involved? Members of her staff? Other nobles? Foreign agents? "I want this investigation to begin immediately," Alexander said. "Spare no expense, and leave no stone unturned. But, Geoffrey, this must remain absolutely confidential. Beyond you, me, and whoever conducts the investigation, no one else can know about this." "Understood, Your Majesty. I'll make the necessary arrangements today." As Sir Geoffrey left the library with the report, Alexander slumped back into his chair and stared at the ornate ceiling above. In the span of a few hours, his world had been turned upside down. The woman he loved and trusted might be a criminal. His kingdom might be under threat from forces he couldn't yet identify. And he was faced with decisions that could determine the fate of a monarchy that had endured for over 1,000 years. Outside, he could hear Isabella's voice in the garden, speaking to one of the groundskeepers about the upcoming spring planting. Her tone was warm and animated, exactly as it always was when she discussed her beloved roses. The sound that had once brought him comfort now filled him with dread. How many other conversations was she having that he knew nothing about? What other secrets was she hiding behind that charming smile and apparent devotion to duty? Alexander closed his eyes and tried to imagine how this crisis might unfold. In the best-case scenario, the investigation would reveal that Dr. Thornfield's suspicions were unfounded, that there were innocent explanations for all the financial irregularities and suspicious meetings. Isabella would be vindicated, their marriage would survive, and the monarchy would emerge stronger than before. But he couldn't shake the feeling that such a happy ending was unlikely. The evidence, while circumstantial, was too extensive to dismiss easily. And if Isabella was guilty of the crimes the evidence suggested, Alexander would face a choice that no king should ever have to make, between the woman he loved and the crown he was sworn to protect. The weight of that potential decision settled over him like a heavy blanket. And, for the first time in his 23-year reign, King Alexander VII wondered if the crown was too heavy for any one person to bear. The Meridian Tower stood like a gleaming monument to modern capitalism in the heart of Valdoria's financial district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the ancient castle that dominated the city's skyline. On the 37th floor, in a conference room with panoramic views of the kingdom, Viktor Petrov adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The queen consort was late, which was unusual for someone who prided herself on punctuality. Petrov had been Meridian Industries' regional director for Eastern Europe for 8 years, and in that time, he had orchestrated some of the most complex international deals in the energy sector. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for the delicate dance he had been performing with the Valdorian royal family for the past 18 months. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever attempted, and the potential rewards were beyond calculation. His secure phone buzzed with a text message, running 10 minutes behind. Security concerns. Petrov allowed himself a small smile. Isabella's attention to security had been one of the things that had initially impressed him about working with her. She understood the importance of discretion, the need for absolute confidentiality in arrangements that could not afford public scrutiny. It was a quality that had made their partnership both possible and profitable. The door to the conference room opened, and Isabella entered with the quiet confidence that characterized all her movements. She was dressed in a charcoal gray business suit with minimal jewelry, a far cry from the elegant gowns and tiaras that the public associated with her royal appearances. In this context, she looked more like a successful corporate executive than a queen consort, which was exactly the image she cultivated for these meetings. "Victor," she said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I apologize for the delay. There was an unexpected issue at the palace that required my attention." Petrov stood and shook her hand, noting the slight tension in her grip. "Not to worry at all, Your Royal Highness. I trust everything is resolved. Please, as we've discussed, in this setting I prefer Isabella," she replied, taking a seat across from him at the polished conference table. "And yes, everything is under control. Now, what updates do you have for me?" Petrov opened a leather portfolio and extracted a series of documents, each marked with discrete classification symbols. "The renewable energy legislation that His Majesty is considering has been making excellent progress through the parliamentary review process. Our analysts believe there's an 85% probability that it will pass in its current form within the next 6 weeks." Isabella nodded, though Petrov noticed she seemed less pleased by this news than he had expected. "That's good to hear. And the contract specifications we discussed? Everything is in place. Once the legislation passes, Meridian will be positioned to submit a winning bid for the offshore wind project. The preliminary estimates suggest a contract value of approximately £4.3 billion over 15 years. And the foundation's share? Petrov slid a single page across the table. As agreed, 10% of net profits will be donated to approved charitable organizations through the Royal Charitable Foundation over the life of the contract. Based on current projections, that represents approximately £60 million. Isabella picked up the document and studied it carefully. To anyone observing the meeting, the arrangement would appear perfectly legitimate. Meridian Industries was committing to substantial charitable contributions as part of their corporate social responsibility program, with the donations being administered by one of Valdoria's most respected charitable organizations. The fact that the Queen Consort happened to run that organization was simply a happy coincidence that would ensure the funds were used effectively. But Petrov and Isabella both knew the reality was far more complex. The charitable donations were just the visible portion of an arrangement that included significant financial benefits for Isabella personally, routed through carefully constructed offshore accounts that would be nearly impossible to trace back to her. The queen consort, who lived modestly on her royal allowance, was secretly accumulating a fortune that would eventually make her one of the wealthiest women in Europe. "There's something else we need to discuss," Isabella said, setting the document aside. "I've become aware that certain financial records are being scrutinized by outside parties. Nothing immediate, but I wanted to alert you to the possibility of increased attention on our arrangements." Petrov felt a chill run through him. What kind of scrutiny? Government auditors? Law enforcement? Academic research, as far as I can tell. A historian from the university has been examining foundation records for some sort of book project. But I'm concerned that academic inquiry could lead to more serious investigation if certain patterns are identified. How much do they know? Isabella shook her head. I'm not entirely sure. The research appears to be focused on international charitable activities, but the specific scope of their access to financial records is unclear. It may be nothing, but given the sensitivity of our arrangement, I felt you should be informed. Petrov leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. He had been involved in questionable business practices before, but never anything that involved a member of a royal family. The potential for exposure was catastrophic not just for him personally, but for Meridian Industries as a whole. If their arrangement with Isabella became public, it would trigger investigations in multiple countries and potentially destroy one of Europe's largest energy companies. "What do you recommend we do?" he asked. "For now, we continue as planned, but with enhanced precautions. I suggest we suspend any new financial transactions until we have a clearer picture of the research scope. And, going forward, all communications should be conducted through the secure channels we established." Isabella reached into her purse and retrieved a small electronic device that looked like an ordinary smartphone but was actually a specialized encrypted communicator. Petrov had a matching device, part of a system that Meridian's security department had developed for sensitive international negotiations. Their conversations through the system were protected by military-grade encryption that would be virtually impossible for outside parties to intercept or decode. "I'll be in touch through the secure system within 48 hours with a more detailed assessment of the situation," Isabella continued. "In the meantime, I suggest you review all documentation related to our arrangement and ensure that nothing exists that could definitively link Meridian to any payments beyond the legitimate charitable contributions." Petrov nodded, though he was already mentally cataloging the various records and communications that would need to be secured or destroyed. "What about the offshore accounts? Should we consider moving those funds?" "Not immediately. Moving large sums of money suddenly could actually draw more attention than leaving them in place. But we should develop contingency plans in case rapid action becomes necessary." As they concluded their meeting, Petrov couldn't help but admire Isabella's composure under pressure. When he had first been approached about this arrangement 18 months ago, he had harbored doubts about working with someone whose experience was primarily in royal protocol and charitable work rather than international business. But she had proven to be as sophisticated and ruthless as any corporate executive he had ever encountered. The arrangement had been her idea originally, proposed through intermediaries who had approached Meridian about potential investment opportunities in Valdoria's emerging green energy sector. The initial concept had been relatively simple. Meridian would make strategic charitable donations to support the Royal Foundation's work, while Isabella would use her influence to ensure that legislation and regulatory decisions favored companies committed to environmental responsibility and community investment. Over time, the arrangement had evolved into something far more complex and lucrative. Isabella had proven remarkably effective at shaping her husband's policy decisions, often through subtle suggestions during their private conversations that resulted in significant advantages for Meridian's business interests. Her personal compensation for these services had grown accordingly, hidden within a web of offshore accounts and shell companies that would be extremely difficult for investigators to unravel. But Petrov had always known that such arrangements carried enormous risks. Royal families were subject to intense scrutiny, and any hint of corruption could trigger investigations that would spare no expense in uncovering the truth. The key to their success had been maintaining absolute secrecy and ensuring that all visible transactions appeared completely legitimate. Now, with the possibility of academic research potentially identifying suspicious patterns, that secrecy was under threat. Petrov made a mental note to contact Meridian's chief security officer as soon as he returned to his office. They would need to review all aspects of their Valdorian operations and prepare for various scenarios ranging from minor public relations challenges to full-scale criminal investigations. As Isabella prepared to leave the conference room, she turned back to Petrov with an expression he had never seen before. For the first time since he had known her, the queen consort looked genuinely worried. "Victor, I want you to understand something," she said, her voice lower than usual. "I've spent 16 years building a life and a reputation in this country. I have no intention of allowing some academic researcher to destroy what I've accomplished. Whatever it takes to protect our arrangement, I'm prepared to do it." The implications of her words sent a chill through Petrov. He had assumed that if their arrangement was ever exposed, Isabella would simply claim ignorance and attempt to minimize the damage. But her tone suggested she was contemplating more aggressive measures to prevent exposure in the first place. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked carefully. Isabella's smile returned, but this time it held no warmth whatsoever. "I'm suggesting that we both have too much to lose to allow this situation to spiral out of control. I'll handle the research issue from my end. You focus on ensuring that Meridian's records provide no ammunition for potential investigators. Together, we can weather this storm. After she left, Petrov remained in the conference room for several minutes, staring out at the view of the palace in the distance. Somewhere in those ancient walls, King Alexander was going about his daily duties, completely unaware that his wife was orchestrating a conspiracy that could destroy his kingdom. The irony was almost overwhelming. Petrov had met the king on several occasions during official state functions, and he had been impressed by Alexander's genuine commitment to his country and his people. The king was exactly what Valdoria needed: intelligent, principled, and dedicated to using his position to benefit others rather than himself. It seemed tragically unfair that such a man should be betrayed by the person closest to him. But fairness was a luxury that Petrov couldn't afford to consider. Too much money was at stake, both for Meridian Industries and for his own personal interests. If protecting their arrangement required destroying evidence, manipulating investigations, or even worse, then that was what would happen. The energy business was not for the squeamish, and Petrov had not risen to his current position by allowing moral considerations to interfere with profitable opportunities. He gathered his documents and prepared to leave, already planning the secure communications he would need to send to Meridian's headquarters. The next few weeks would be critical in determining whether their Valdorian operation could continue or whether they would need to implement emergency protocols to minimize their exposure. As he waited for the elevator, Petrov reflected on the strange turn his career had taken. 2 years ago, he had been a respectable businessman focused on legitimate energy investments. Now he was conspiring with a queen consort to manipulate a kingdom's laws for corporate benefit while helping her accumulate a secret fortune through offshore accounts. The transformation had happened gradually, each step seeming reasonable at the time, until he found himself in a position that would have horrified his younger self. But there was no going back now. The web of financial arrangements and political influence they had constructed was too complex to unravel without destroying everyone involved. His only choice was to move forward and hope that they could protect their secret long enough to complete their plans. The elevator doors opened, and Petrov stepped inside, watching the floors count down as he descended toward the parking garage. In 12 hours, he would be on a private jet to Meridian's headquarters in Geneva, where he would brief the company's leadership on the developing situation in Valdoria. By the end of the week, some of the most powerful people in the international energy industry would be focused on protecting a secret that could topple a government and destroy lives across 2 countries. As the elevator reached the garage level, Petrov's encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Isabella. "Thank you for a productive meeting. Look forward to continued success together." He deleted the message immediately and walked toward his car, knowing that the simple act of meeting with the queen consort had set in motion events that would reshape the kingdom of Valdoria in ways that no one could yet imagine. The only question was whether King Alexander would discover the truth before it was too late to save his throne. Dr. Margaret Thornfield had always believed that the truth had a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to search for it. In her 25 years as a historian specializing in European political institutions, she had uncovered corruption scandals, exposed long-buried diplomatic secrets, and traced the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated events across decades of international relations. But as she sat in her cramped office at the University of Valdoria, surrounded by towers of financial documents and legal papers, she was beginning to understand that some truths came with a price that could be higher than she was prepared to pay. The morning had started normally enough. Margaret had arrived at her office at 7:30, as was her habit, carrying a cup of strong coffee and a sense of anticipation about the progress she was making on her research into royal charitable organizations. The project had begun as a relatively straightforward academic exercise, examining how European monarchies had adapted their traditional philanthropic roles to address modern international crises. But what she had discovered in the archives of the Royal Charitable Foundation had transformed her scholarly investigation into something far more serious and potentially dangerous. The first sign that her work was attracting unwanted attention had come 3 days earlier, when she noticed a man in a dark suit photographing her car in the university parking lot. She had initially dismissed it as paranoia, a byproduct of spending too many hours analyzing suspicious financial transactions and questionable business relationships. But when she spotted the same man sitting in the lobby of her apartment building the next morning, her academic skepticism gave way to genuine concern. Margaret's research methodology was meticulous and thorough, developed over decades of working with historical documents that often contained deliberately obscured or coded information. She began each project by creating comprehensive timelines that cross-referenced public events with private communications, financial records with political decisions, and official statements with documented actions. In the case of the Royal Charitable Foundation, this approach had revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore. The breakthrough had come when she discovered a series of internal memos from Meridian Industries that had been inadvertently included in a batch of documents released under Valdoria's Freedom of Information laws. The memos, dated from 18 months ago, referenced charitable partnerships and royal relationship management in the context of the kingdom's renewable energy legislation. Taken alone, the references could have been interpreted as standard corporate social responsibility initiatives. But when combined with the financial irregularities she had already identified in the Foundation's records, they painted a picture of systematic corruption at the highest levels of Valdorian society. Margaret had spent the weekend analyzing bank records, cross-referencing them with Isabella's official schedule and public appearances. What she found was a pattern of financial activity that coincided precisely with key moments in Valdoria's legislative process. Large donations to the Foundation appeared just before parliamentary votes on energy policy. Mysterious meetings between Isabella and corporate representatives preceded regulatory decisions that benefited those same companies. Most damning of all, money had flowed from Meridian-connected accounts to offshore entities that seemed to exist solely to obscure the ultimate destination of the funds. She had been so absorbed in her analysis that she hadn't immediately noticed the man standing in the doorway of her office. When she looked up from her computer screen, she found herself face-to-face with someone she didn't recognize, a tall, well-dressed individual in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Thornfield?" the man asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been German or Swiss. "I apologize for disturbing you. My name is Henrik Zimmerman, and I represent certain interests that may be affected by your current research project." Margaret felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry, but I don't recall making any appointments this morning. If you're interested in discussing my research, you'll need to contact my department and arrange a proper meeting." Zimmerman stepped into the office without invitation and closed the door behind him. The action was performed casually, but Margaret immediately understood it as a demonstration of power. This man was not going to be dismissed by appeals to university protocol. "I'm afraid the nature of my visit requires a more immediate conversation," he said, taking a seat across from her desk without being offered one. "You've been examining financial records related to certain European charitable organizations, and I understand you've identified some patterns that concern you." "My research is purely academic," Margaret replied, though she was already considering how quickly she could reach the emergency button that connected directly to campus security. "I'm writing a book about the evolution of royal philanthropy in the modern era. Nothing more than that." Zimmerman smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Dr. Thornfield, we both know that's not entirely accurate. You've stumbled upon information that extends far beyond academic interest. The question is what you intend to do with that information." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to assess her situation. The fact that this man knew about her research suggested surveillance that went far beyond the casual observation she had noticed over the past few days. Someone with significant resources was monitoring her work closely enough to identify specific aspects of her investigation. The implications were terrifying. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded unconvincing. Zimmerman reached into his jacket and extracted a tablet, which he activated and placed on her desk. The screen displayed copies of her research notes, complete with her handwritten annotations and highlighted passages from Foundation documents. The level of detail was impossible unless someone had gained access to her office, her computer files, or both. "You've identified financial irregularities in the Royal Charitable Foundation's operations," Zimmerman continued, his tone conversational despite the threatening nature of the situation. "You've traced connections between charitable donations and legislative decisions. You've discovered offshore accounts and shell companies that suggest systematic corruption involving members of the Valdorian royal family." Margaret stared at the tablet, her academic training warring with a growing sense of fear. Every instinct she had developed as a researcher told her to continue investigating, to follow the evidence wherever it led. But her basic survival instincts were screaming warnings about the danger she had unknowingly stumbled into. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to understand the gravity of what you've discovered," Zimmerman replied. The information you've collected could destroy lives, topple governments, and trigger international incidents that would affect millions of people. The question is whether you're prepared to accept responsibility for those consequences. The responsibility belongs to whoever committed the crimes I've uncovered, not to the researcher who discovered them, Margaret said, though her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to project. Zimmerman leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. Dr. Thornfield, you're an intelligent woman with a distinguished academic career. You have tenure at a respected university, a comfortable home, and the respect of your colleagues. You've built a good life through hard work and dedication to your field. Why would you want to risk all of that for a story that will only bring you pain and danger? Because the truth matters, Margaret replied, though she was beginning to question whether her principles were worth the price she might have to pay to uphold them. The truth is more complicated than your research suggests, Zimmerman said. What appears to be corruption may actually be sophisticated international diplomacy. What looks like criminal activity may be legitimate business conducted through legal structures designed to protect privacy. You're making assumptions based on incomplete information, and those assumptions could destroy innocent people. Margaret knew he was lying, or at least distorting the truth in fundamental ways. Her analysis had been too thorough, the patterns too clear, for the activities she had uncovered to be anything other than deliberate corruption. But she was also beginning to understand that the truth alone might not be enough to protect her from the consequences of revealing it. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Zimmerman reached into his pocket and extracted a business card, which he placed on the desk next to the tablet. I represent a consulting firm that specializes in helping academics and researchers navigate complex international situations. We would like to offer you a position that would allow you to continue your valuable research while ensuring that sensitive information is handled appropriately. Margaret picked up the card and examined it. The company name was unfamiliar, but the contact information included addresses in Geneva, London, and New York. What kind of position? Senior Research Director for European Historical Studies. The salary would be approximately 3 times what you currently earn at the university. You would have access to archives and resources that most academics can only dream of. Your work would be published by prestigious international journals and would establish you as one of the leading experts in your field. The offer was extraordinary, far beyond anything Margaret could have expected in her academic career. But she understood that it came with strings attached that would effectively end her independence as a researcher. And in exchange, you would agree to modify your current research project to focus on the positive aspects of royal charitable work rather than searching for scandals that may not actually exist. The book you publish would celebrate the important humanitarian work being done by European monarchies rather than undermining public confidence in these institutions. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind struggling to process the choice she was being offered. Accept the position, and she would achieve professional success beyond her wildest dreams while abandoning the most important investigation of her career. Reject it, and she would face consequences that she couldn't even begin to imagine. I need time to consider your offer, she said finally. Zimmerman stood and retrieved his tablet. Of course, but I should mention that time is somewhat limited. My clients are eager to resolve this situation, and they've authorized me to explore various approaches depending on your decision. I sincerely hope we can reach an agreement that benefits everyone involved. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. If she couldn't be bought, other methods would be employed to silence her research. Margaret had read enough history to know that people who threatened powerful interests sometimes simply disappeared, their research destroyed, and their reputations ruined by carefully orchestrated scandals. After Zimmerman left, Margaret sat alone in her office for nearly an hour, staring at the business card and trying to decide what to do. Her research represented years of work and had uncovered evidence of crimes that could affect the future of an entire kingdom. But continuing her investigation would put her in direct conflict with people who clearly had the resources and motivation to destroy her life. She thought about her graduate students, who depended on her guidance and support. She considered her elderly mother, who lived comfortably on the income from Margaret's university position and the modest inheritance from her father. She reflected on the colleagues who respected her work and the professional reputation she had spent decades building. All of it could be destroyed if she chose to fight against forces that were clearly more powerful than she was. But she also thought about King Alexander, who by all accounts was a decent man trying to serve his country honorably while unaware that his wife was betraying everything he stood for. She considered the people of Valdoria, who deserved to know that their charitable donations were being diverted to enrich corrupt officials. She reflected on the principles that had guided her throughout her academic career, the belief that truth and transparency were essential to a functioning democracy. Margaret opened her laptop and began typing an email to her department chair, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss a matter of institutional importance. She wasn't sure yet what she would tell him, but she knew she needed allies if she was going to survive what was coming. The decision to continue her investigation would put everything she cared about at risk, but abandoning it would mean betraying everything she believed in. As she worked on her email, Margaret's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering, wondering if Zimmerman's associates were already implementing their backup plans. Dr. Thornfield? This is Sir Geoffrey Walsh from the Royal Protection Service. I was wondering if we might arrange a meeting to discuss your recent research project. Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. If the royal family was already aware of her investigation, it might mean that King Alexander was preparing to take action against the corruption she had uncovered. But it could also mean that her work had attracted attention at the highest levels of government, making her situation even more dangerous than she had realized. I would be happy to meet with you, Sir Geoffrey. When would be convenient? Would this afternoon be possible? I believe the matters we need to discuss are quite urgent. As Margaret agreed to the meeting and hung up the phone, she realized that whatever choice she made about Zimmerman's offer might already be irrelevant. The investigation had taken on a momentum of its own, and she was no longer in control of where it might lead. The only question now was whether she would emerge from the coming storm with her principles intact, or whether the truth she had uncovered would destroy everyone it touched, including herself. The secure briefing room in the basement of the Royal Protection Service headquarters felt like something out of a spy novel to Dr. Margaret Thornfield. The windowless space contained only a conference table, 6 chairs, and an array of electronic equipment that she assumed was designed to prevent eavesdropping. Sir Geoffrey Walsh sat across from her, flanked by 2 individuals he had introduced only as security specialists, whose serious expressions and expensive suits suggested they were far more than ordinary civil servants. Margaret had spent the previous 3 hours providing a detailed briefing on her research, walking the assembled group through every piece of evidence she had compiled regarding the Royal Charitable Foundation's suspicious activities. She had shared copies of financial records, meeting schedules, and the damning internal communications from Meridian Industries that had first alerted her to the scope of the corruption. Now she sat nervously as Sir Geoffrey and his colleagues reviewed her materials in silence. Dr. Thornfield, Sir Geoffrey said finally, what you've presented to us represents one of the most serious security threats this monarchy has faced in decades. The evidence you've compiled is thorough, compelling, and absolutely devastating. I want you to understand that by bringing this to our attention, you may have saved the kingdom from a scandal that could have destroyed our constitutional system. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and continuing anxiety. What happens now? Will there be an investigation? Will charges be filed? One of the security specialists, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair, leaned forward. The situation is more complicated than a straightforward criminal investigation, Dr. Thornfield. We're dealing with a member of the royal family whose actions could trigger a constitutional crisis if handled improperly. Every step we take must be carefully considered to minimize the potential damage to the monarchy as an institution. What about the evidence I've gathered? Surely this proves that crimes have been committed. Sir Geoffrey nodded grimly. Oh, there's no question that serious crimes have been committed. The question is how to proceed in a way that protects the kingdom's stability while ensuring that justice is served. That's where we need your continued assistance. Margaret had expected to turn over her research and step back while the authorities handled the situation. The suggestion that her involvement was just beginning filled her with dread. What kind of assistance? We need you to continue your research, but now as part of an official investigation, the second security specialist explained. He was a younger man with the crisp bearing of someone with military background. You've identified the key players and mapped out the basic structure of the corruption network. But we need more detailed intelligence about their operations, their communications, and their future plans. You want me to spy on the Queen Consort? Margaret asked, incredulous. We want you to complete the investigation you've already started, Sir Geoffrey clarified. But now you'll have official support and protection while you do it. The Royal Protection Service will ensure your safety while you gather the additional evidence we need to build an airtight case. Margaret shook her head slowly. I'm an academic, not a secret agent. I don't have the training or the temperament for this kind of work. You have something more valuable than training, the female specialist said. You have a legitimate reason to be examining these records, and you've already demonstrated remarkable skill at uncovering hidden connections. Most importantly, your continued research won't raise suspicions because it's consistent with the academic project you're already known to be working on. The logic was compelling, but Margaret couldn't shake her discomfort with the role they were asking her to play. What exactly would you want me to do? Sir Geoffrey opened a folder and extracted a series of photographs and documents. We've identified several areas where we need additional intelligence. First, we need to understand the full scope of the financial arrangements between Queen Isabella and Meridian Industries. Your research has identified the basic structure, but we need details about account numbers, transfer mechanisms, and the identities of all intermediaries involved. He spread the photographs across the table, revealing surveillance images of various individuals in business suits meeting in hotels, restaurants, and office buildings. Second, we need to map out the complete network of people involved in this conspiracy. We know about Viktor Petrov and his role at Meridian, but there are clearly other players whose identities and functions we haven't yet determined. The female specialist took over the briefing. Third, and perhaps most critically, we need to understand their timeline and ultimate objectives. Are they planning additional legislation manipulation? Are they preparing contingency plans in case their activities are exposed? Do they have allies within the government or the royal household who could help them cover up their crimes? Margaret studied the surveillance photographs, recognizing some faces from her research, but seeing others for the first time. The scope of the conspiracy was clearly larger than she had imagined, involving dozens of people across multiple organizations and countries. How would I gather this kind of intelligence? I can't exactly walk up to these people and ask them about their criminal activities. We've developed a plan that builds on the approach that man Zimmerman used when he visited your office, Sir Geoffrey explained. We know he offered you a position with his consulting firm as a way to co-opt your research. We want you to accept that position. Margaret felt her blood run cold. You want me to join their conspiracy? We want you to pretend to join their conspiracy, the military specialist clarified. By accepting Zimmerman's offer, you'll gain access to their operations from the inside. You'll be able to observe their methods, identify their associates, and document their activities in ways that would be impossible from the outside. That's incredibly dangerous, Margaret protested. If they discover that I'm working with you, there's no telling what they might do to me. We're not minimizing the risks, Sir Geoffrey acknowledged. But we believe the potential intelligence gains outweigh those risks, especially with proper support and protection. You would never be completely alone, and we would have multiple extraction protocols in place if the situation became dangerous. The female specialist opened her own folder and extracted what appeared to be a job offer letter on expensive letterhead. We've already begun preparing for this operation. This is a draft of the contract Zimmerman's firm is likely to offer you, based on intelligence we've gathered about their recruitment methods with other academics they've co-opted. By reviewing it in advance, you'll be prepared to ask the right questions and identify the information we need most. Margaret scanned the document, noting the generous salary, extensive travel opportunities, and access to exclusive archives and research materials. It was exactly the kind of offer that would be difficult for any academic to refuse, which made it an ideal cover for intelligence-gathering operations. How long would this assignment last? She asked. Probably several months, Sir Geoffrey replied. Long enough to gather comprehensive intelligence about their operations and identify all the key players. But we would aim to complete the investigation as quickly as possible to minimize your exposure to risk. Margaret set down the job offer and looked directly at Sir Geoffrey. What happens to Queen Isabella when this is all over? Will she be prosecuted? Exiled? What about King Alexander? The room fell silent for a moment, and Margaret could see the three officials exchanging glances that suggested this was the most difficult aspect of the situation they were facing. That will ultimately be decided by His Majesty, Sir Geoffrey said finally. Our job is to provide him with complete and accurate information about the extent of the Queen Consort's crimes. How he chooses to respond will depend on various factors, including the need to protect the monarchy's long-term stability. In other words, she might escape prosecution entirely if charging her would threaten the royal family, Margaret said. Justice and political stability don't always align perfectly, the female specialist acknowledged. Our primary responsibility is to protect the kingdom and its institutions. Individual accountability, while important, must be considered within that larger context. Margaret understood the implications of what they were telling her. Even if her investigation succeeded in documenting extensive criminal activity, the final outcome might still involve covering up the crimes to protect the monarchy. The truth she had spent months uncovering might never see the light of day. "I need some time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course," Sir Geoffrey replied. "But I should mention that time is limited. Zimmerman expects an answer to his offer within the next 48 hours, and we need to begin preparation immediately if you decide to accept the assignment." As Margaret prepared to leave the briefing room, the military specialist handed her a secure communication device disguised as an ordinary smartphone. "If you decide to proceed, use this to contact us. All communications through this device are encrypted and untraceable. More importantly, if you ever feel you're in immediate danger, press the red button on the side and hold it for 3 seconds. That will trigger an emergency response that will have protective personnel at your location within minutes." Walking back to her car in the late afternoon sunlight, Margaret tried to process everything she had learned. In the span of a few hours, her academic research project had evolved into an official intelligence operation that could determine the fate of a royal family and reshape the political landscape of an entire kingdom. The decision she faced was no longer simply about whether to publish controversial research, but about whether to risk her life to uncover the full truth about a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of Valdorian society. Her phone rang as she reached her car, displaying a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if Zimmerman or his associates were calling to pressure her for a decision. But when she answered, she heard a voice that made her heart sink. "Dr. Thornfield? This is Detective Inspector Sarah Chon with the Metropolitan Police. I'm afraid I have some bad news about your research assistant, David Morrison." Margaret's hands began to shake as she gripped the phone. David was a graduate student who had been helping her organize financial records from the Foundation archives. He was scheduled to meet with her tomorrow morning to discuss several irregularities he had identified in recent donation patterns. "What's happened to David?" she asked, though she was already dreading the answer. "He was found dead in his apartment this morning. The preliminary investigation suggests suicide, but there are some aspects of the scene that we find unusual. I was hoping you could answer some questions about his recent work and state of mind." Margaret felt the world spinning around her as she realized that her investigation had already claimed its first victim. Whether David had been murdered or driven to suicide by threats similar to what she had experienced, his death was directly connected to the research they had been conducting together. The stakes of the game she was being asked to play had just become tragically clear. "I'll be right there," she told Detective Inspector Chun, knowing that she had no choice but to accept Sir Geoffrey's offer. David's death had eliminated any possibility of walking away from the investigation. The only question now was whether she could gather enough evidence to ensure that his death would not be in vain. As she drove toward the police station, Margaret activated the secure communication device and sent a brief message. "I accept the assignment. When do we begin?" The response came within seconds. "Preparation begins tonight. Welcome to the operation, Dr. Thornfield." The grand ballroom of Valdoria Palace had witnessed countless historic moments over its 800-year history. Kings had been crowned within its gilded walls, peace treaties had been signed beneath its crystal chandeliers, and generations of European royalty had celebrated marriages, births, and diplomatic triumphs on its polished marble floors. But on this chilly evening in late March, the ornate chamber was about to host a confrontation that would determine whether the Valdorian monarchy would survive the 21st century. King Alexander VII stood before the massive fireplace at the far end of the ballroom, its carved mantelpiece depicting scenes from Valdoria's medieval golden age when his ancestors had led crusades and established trade routes that stretched across 3 continents. He was dressed in the formal military uniform he reserved for the most solemn state occasions, complete with the ceremonial sword that had been carried by every Valdorian king since the 15th century. Despite the grandeur of his surroundings and the weight of tradition embodied in his attire, Alexander felt more alone and vulnerable than at any point in his 23-year reign. 6 weeks had passed since Dr. Margaret Thornfield's investigation had revealed the extent of Queen Isabella's crimes, and the intelligence operation conducted by the Royal Protection Service had uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The evidence now filled 17 boxes stored in the palace's most secure vault, documenting financial crimes, political manipulation, and International conspiracy on a scale that threatened not only the Valdorian monarchy, but the stability of several allied governments. Isabella entered the ballroom through the ceremonial doors, her footsteps echoing in the vast space as she approached her husband. She was dressed in the deep blue gown she had worn to their wedding reception 16 years earlier, a choice that Alexander recognized as either a final gesture of sentimentality or a calculated attempt to evoke memories of happier times. Her expression was composed, almost serene, as if she were arriving for an ordinary state dinner rather than a confrontation that would determine her fate. "Alexander," she said softly as she stopped several feet away from him. "I assume you wanted to discuss the research project that's been causing such concern among your security advisors." The calmness in her voice surprised him. Alexander had expected anger, denial, or at least some show of emotion when faced with irrefutable evidence of her crimes. Instead, Isabella seemed almost relieved that the conversation was finally taking place. "You know why we're here," Alexander replied, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion that came from weeks of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "The question is whether you're prepared to tell me the truth, or whether you're going to continue pretending that you've done nothing wrong." Isabella walked to the windows that overlooked the palace gardens, her beloved roses barely visible in the gathering darkness. "The truth is more complicated than your investigators have led you to believe. Yes, I entered into financial arrangements that weren't entirely transparent. Yes, I used my position to influence policy decisions that benefited certain corporate interests. But everything I did was motivated by a desire to secure our future in a world that's increasingly hostile to monarchy." "Our future?" Alexander's voice rose slightly. "You've accumulated over £40 million in secret offshore accounts while telling me we need to reduce the royal household budget. You've taken bribes from foreign corporations while I've been working to strengthen Valdoria's ethical reputation in international affairs. How exactly does any of that secure our future?" Isabella turned back to face him, and, for the first time since entering the ballroom, her composure showed signs of cracking. "You still don't understand what we're facing, do you? Look around Europe, Alexander. How many monarchies remain? How many have been abolished in the last 50 years? We're living fossils, relics of a bygone age that most people consider irrelevant at best and parasitic at worst." She gestured toward the portraits of former kings that lined the ballroom walls. "Your ancestors ruled by divine right and absolute authority. They commanded armies, controlled vast territories, and shaped the destiny of nations. What do you control? You sign legislation that Parliament writes, attend ceremonies that tourists photograph, and give speeches that no one remembers a week later. We're ceremonial decorations, Alexander, and ceremonial decorations get discarded when people decide they're no longer worth the cost." Alexander had heard versions of this argument before, usually from Republican politicians and newspaper editorial writers who questioned the relevance of constitutional monarchy in the modern world. But hearing it from Isabella, delivered with the passionate conviction of someone who had clearly spent years developing these ideas, was devastating. "So your solution was to become exactly what our critics claim we are?" he asked. "Corrupt parasites who exploit our positions for personal gain." "My solution was to prepare for a future where we might need resources that aren't dependent on parliamentary appropriation or public approval," Isabella replied. "Do you think the Spanish royal family regretted having access to Swiss bank accounts when they were forced into exile? Do you imagine the Romanian monarchy wished they had been more scrupulous about financial transparency when the communists seized power?" Alexander shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't 1930s Europe, Isabella. We're not facing revolution or foreign invasion. The greatest threat to our survival as a monarchy is exactly the kind of corruption you've been engaged in. If this scandal becomes public, it will destroy whatever legitimacy we have left. Which is why it must never become public," Isabella said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "The evidence your investigators have gathered could be contained if we act decisively. Dr. Thornfield's research can be discredited, the financial records can be sealed for national security reasons, and the whole affair can disappear into the classified archives where it belongs." For a moment, Alexander was speechless. Even knowing what he knew about Isabella's crimes, he hadn't expected her to propose covering them up rather than accepting responsibility for them. "You're talking about obstructing justice, intimidating witnesses, and suppressing evidence of serious crimes. How is that supposed to protect the monarchy?" "Because the alternative is worse," Isabella said simply. "If this investigation proceeds, it won't just destroy me. It will destroy you, the monarchy, and probably the kingdom itself." Do you want to be remembered as the last king of Valdoria, the man who brought down a 1,000-year dynasty because he was too principled to protect his own interests? The weight of her argument settled over Alexander like a heavy blanket. She was right that the revelation of her crimes would trigger a constitutional crisis that could lead to the abolition of the monarchy. The Republican movement in Valdoria was small but vocal, and a corruption scandal involving the royal family would give them exactly the ammunition they needed to convince the public that the monarchy was an outdated and harmful institution. But the cost of suppressing the evidence would be even higher in the long term. Alexander would spend the rest of his reign knowing that his throne rested on a foundation of lies and covered-up crimes. Every public appearance would be shadowed by the knowledge that he was protecting a conspiracy that had betrayed the trust of his people. The monarchy might survive, but it would be a hollow victory that corrupted everything it was supposed to represent. There's a third option, Alexander said finally. You confess your crimes, accept responsibility for your actions, and help us minimize the damage to the monarchy by cooperating with a full investigation. Isabella laughed, but the sound held no humor. And then what? Do you think the people of Valdoria will forgive and forget because I apologized? Do you imagine that foreign governments will continue treating you with respect after your wife is convicted of international fraud? You're being naive, Alexander. What I'm being is honest, he replied. For the first time in this entire marriage, I'm telling you exactly what I think without worrying about the political consequences. Your crimes are going to be exposed whether we cooperate with that exposure or not. The only question is whether we face the crisis with integrity or compound it with even more lies. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the ballroom. Sir Geoffrey Walsh appeared in the doorway, his expression grave as he approached the king and queen. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention, he said. Viktor Petrov was arrested this morning by Swiss authorities on charges of international money laundering and conspiracy to commit fraud. The arrest was based on evidence provided by Valdorian investigators, and Mr. Petrov has indicated his willingness to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations in exchange for reduced charges. Isabella's composure finally cracked completely. The color drained from her face, and Alexander could see her hands trembling as the implications of Petrov's arrest became clear. With the Meridian Industries regional director providing testimony about their arrangement, any hope of containing the scandal had just evaporated. Furthermore, Sir Geoffrey continued, we've received word that several international news organizations have been alerted to the existence of the investigation. We estimate that we have perhaps 48 hours before the first reports are published, regardless of any action we might take to prevent disclosure. Alexander felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The decision he had been agonizing over for weeks had been taken out of his hands. There would be no cover-up, no suppression of evidence, and no protection of Isabella's crimes. The truth would come out, and they would all have to face the consequences. What do you recommend? He asked Sir Geoffrey. I recommend that we get ahead of the story by releasing a comprehensive statement acknowledging the investigation and Your Majesty's cooperation with it. We should emphasize that the monarchy itself was victimized by these crimes, and that you've taken decisive action to ensure accountability and prevent any recurrence. Isabella spoke for the first time since Sir Geoffrey's arrival, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander, you don't have to do this. There are still options, still ways to protect what we've built together. Alexander looked at his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since they had married. The woman he had loved and trusted was gone, replaced by someone willing to sacrifice everything they supposedly shared in order to protect her criminal enterprise. The betrayal was complete and irrevocable. Sir Geoffrey, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. Please prepare a statement announcing that Queen Consort Isabella is being stripped of all royal titles and privileges, effective immediately. She will be given 24 hours to leave Valdoria permanently, after which she will face arrest and prosecution for her crimes. Isabella stared at him in shock, apparently unable to believe that he was willing to destroy their marriage and potentially the monarchy itself rather than protect her secrets. Alexander, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about what this will cost you. I have been thinking about it, he replied. For weeks, I've been trying to find a way to save both you and the crown. But I've finally realized that some things are more important than survival. If the monarchy can't exist without corruption and lies, then it doesn't deserve to exist at all. Sir Geoffrey nodded, and left the ballroom to implement the king's instructions. Isabella remained frozen near the windows, her reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass. Alexander stood by the fireplace, feeling the weight of the ceremonial sword at his side, and wondering if he would be the last king to wear it. "You've destroyed everything," Isabella said finally, her voice filled with a mixture of rage and despair. "Everything we built, everything we worked for, everything we could have accomplished together. You've thrown it all away for the sake of principles that no one else in the world still believes in." Alexander walked toward the ballroom doors, pausing only to deliver his final words to the woman who had once been his partner in both marriage and monarchy. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps integrity and honor are outdated concepts in the modern world. But if that's true, then I'd rather be the last king of a fallen dynasty than the first ruler of a corrupt one." As he left Isabella alone in the ballroom where their wedding reception had taken place 16 years earlier, Alexander could hear the sound of rain beginning to fall against the tall windows. By morning, the gardens would be refreshed and renewed, ready for another season of growth. Whether the monarchy would survive its own renewal remained to be seen, but Alexander was confident that he had made the only choice that would allow him to sleep peacefully, regardless of what crown might rest on his head when he woke. The investigation that had begun with Dr. Margaret Thornfield's academic curiosity had evolved into the greatest crisis in Valdorian history. But it had also revealed that even in an age of cynicism and compromise, there were still those willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of truth. Whether that would be enough to save the kingdom remained to be seen, but Alexander was determined to find out.